A lot of founders find themselves having built a company that is consistently generating $1 million or $2 million or maybe $10 million a year in revenue. They've got 10 or 20 or 50 happy employees and tens or hundreds or thousands of happy customers or users, and they just don't have the ability to scale beyond that. But that could be great success. That could be really rewarding. That could be a great company. There was a time where I took a big risk. It worked out amazingly well. But man, the fear factor was difficult, and there was something that tipped me over. And in that moment, after that, I literally told myself, next time that happens, just freaking run through the fire. You'll get on the other side of the fire, your survival strengths will kick in, and you're gonna have a great time.
Welcome to my conversation with Daugherty. He is a best-selling author, seasoned business executive, entrepreneur, and startup advisor and investor. But most interestingly, he is the current chairman and a co-founder of Capital Factory, the amazing place I'm at now, but also one of the places where I've literally met the most passionate, hardworking people since I've moved to Austin and probably in my life. This is that conversation with him, the man behind Capital Factory, and he'll be sharing his lessons in the business world and in life with everyone here. Enjoy my conversation with Daugherty. Gordon, thanks for coming on. To those who have no idea of this amazing place that we're in right now, where many of the best relationships, frankly, that I've made here in Austin, what is Capital Factory?
Well, Capital Factory is the center of gravity for entrepreneurs in Texas. We have boots on the ground in Austin, Dallas, San Antonio, and Houston, and we meet the best entrepreneurs and best founders, and we help them find their next investors and customers and talent.
And how did that idea come to be? At this point, I'm assuming you've made your rounds in business and you've identified that there is such a big need for something like this. Who did you talk to, and what was that initial idea formulation like?
I have to give credit to my co-founder, Joshua Baer, for the original idea, but you have to take yourself back to 2010, 2011 in Austin, Texas. Austin was a tech hub at the time. It had been a tech hub for decades. There was an early and somewhat thriving startup ecosystem on a much smaller scale here in Austin, but there was nothing really going on downtown. Downtown was not a big thing. I know that's hard to imagine now in 2022, but there were no co-working spaces in downtown Austin. There was only one or two co-working spaces anywhere in Austin, but nothing downtown. So there was no real center of gravity for the entrepreneurial ecosystem to kind of form and come together as a community. And so Joshua Baer decided to take a floor in the building of 701 Brazos. Happened to be the 16th floor, the floor that we're on right now. That's about the time that I joined him as he was building this out. And his vision was to essentially build a startup ecosystem underneath the brand of Capital Factory, a place where startups could convene, they could attend events that were meaningful to them. They could join a community. We decided that we would build something that resembled an accelerator program, but not a boot camp style accelerator. We decided we would build a venture fund. And those were kind of the original core pillars of Capital Factory, and we essentially kind of grew it from there into what people know about Capital Factory today, including expanding around the great state of Texas under what we call our Texas Startup Manifesto.
Yes, and my experience with it has been amazing, frankly, because I moved here a little over a year ago, and now in Austin that seems old. People are coming here, well, even at the event last night, some people were flying in the day of.
Yeah.
So everybody is new here in Austin, which really allows them to have their doors open. Everybody wants to connect. But I think for founders or people who are just interested in doing their own thing, whether it's a traditional startup model where they're raising, or they just want to have that freedom of being their own boss, there was, at least to my knowledge, nothing that you can connect with like-minded individuals for. And I think you can speak to this more than anyone else here. Who you surround yourself is extraordinarily important.
Sure.
And I'd like to get your perspective on that too, of you started out, if I recall correctly, studying computer science. Who were the kinds of people in your life that nudged you in the direction to where you are today?
That's an interesting question. I can say that Well, I started my career in Fortune 500, so I got a computer science degree, but I did not write code as I went into the workplace. You have to go back to 1986, and writing code was pretty boring because of the programming languages that were used then. So I actually started my career in sales, enterprise sales at IBM. I had interned in an IBM sales office for a couple years while I was getting my degree. So I can say one piece of really good advice I got in those early days was when my second line manager at IBM asked me a question that somehow resembled, what do you want to be when you grow up? And my 21 or 22-year-old response was, well, I think I want to be CEO of a company or maybe sit on the board of directors of a company. That's kind of what I thought. And his reaction was, so you don't aspire to be the senior vice president of global sales for IBM someday? And I told him, no, I didn't even really want to go into sales. I have a computer science degree, but this IBM is a great company, and here I am in sales. So he said, if you want to be CEO and you don't aspire to be the head of our global sales organization, you should zig and zag. As you are up for promotion, you shouldn't move to the type of job that would keep you on that sales progression path. He said we should move you into another function, and after you kind of gain some expertise there, you should jump over to a completely different function. He said if you do that over 20 years or so, you will gain deep insights for how those functions operate, and you would be better equipped to be CEO of IBM or some other company someday. So it was really profound advice that I followed, coupling that with just by luck and circumstance. With each company move, I went smaller and smaller and smaller. It started with kind of a smaller enterprise, smaller than IBM. But then after about 2 jumps, I found myself in the startup land, and I was really comfortable there. So that good advice, the zigging and zagging, and then a little bit of luck and circumstance, finding smaller and smaller companies to find my sweet spot is kind of one of the paths.
So you came from the corporate world, and then you made the jump to startups, as opposed to what some people do. That's what they do from day one. They
Correct.
Just work from startup to startup.
Exactly.
I'm sure that's got to be a culture shock, working from bigger companies who have their systems in place to a startup where things are rickety, you have to be very scrappy. What was that transition like?
Yeah. I talk about this quite a bit to seasoned corporate executives that have spent all their time in large corporations and suddenly want to join a startup, suddenly want to run a startup, suddenly want to be an advisor to a startup. I talk about that shock and how dramatically different it is. I even talk about how they could accidentally do damage to the startup, even though they were super successful for 25 years. In IBM reaching executive ranks, they could actually do damage to a startup because the dramatic different ways that we do things. In my particular case, it was more gradual. IBM was $70 billion. From there I went to a much smaller, but still $15 billion company. So smaller. To me, it felt noticeably smaller and more nimble, but $70 billion to 15. From there I went to a $100 million company. Still not a startup, but an order of magnitude below 15 billion. And from 100 million, I went to a $5 million company. And then from there, I went to a 0 million. So my adjustment was more gradual. Even though those jumps are kind of big jumps, I didn't do it in one fell swoop. So it wasn't as much a shock. The other thing I realized is as I went to a step smaller, one of the advantages I had was I knew how it looked and felt and operated at the bigger levels. So when I found myself in a $100 million company, the thought of becoming a $500 million or billion or $10 billion company was not unfamiliar to me at all.
Right.
And so that, I think, was a little bit of a superpower that I had, which was I could help that smaller company navigate a path to the next handful of clip levels because I had been there and I had experienced it before.
That makes a lot of sense. And just from what I've seen in the things that I've done and some of the other founders I've spoken with, one of the biggest challenges is you don't know what you don't know.
That's right.
So you don't have that muscle memory of being in a big company, of seeing how all the pieces operate. You just see the abyss in front of you, which is why I think having advisors is so crucial.
It is. And I get asked the question quite a bit from entrepreneurs coming out of college. Maybe they dabbled in entrepreneurship, maybe they tried their hand at a startup and it didn't work out while in college, and they decided they do want to do that. But they also, made great grades, let's say, and they have job offers from some bigger companies, and they're really struggling with, should I go straight into a startup, start one or join one, or should I spend a tour of duty in a larger company? And really, of course, I don't have the answer for them. It's a very personal answer. I just talk about the trade-offs. When you start down the path of working for an established company, it doesn't have to be $70 billion IBM, but let's say a $200 million or larger, a truly established company. One of the benefits is you are surrounded by process and discipline and experts, and you get to see the difference in what's required at the different levels: entry-level employee, first-line manager, second-line manager, director, VP, senior VP, and you just get a feeling for how all of that works when it's at scale and hopefully done well. The other benefit of working for a large company, I can go back to my IBM days. IBM invested a lot of time and money in my personal and professional development. I was an enterprise sales rep. Would you believe that I spent 1 year in sales training? They hired me, paid me a salary, and would not allow me to go start closing business until I finished a 1 year, very disciplined curriculum around learning the IBM sales method. That's a huge investment in time and money in me. And then after that, I spent at least 30, if not 40 hours every year in some kind of professional development, courses, seminars, workshops, and things. I didn't fully appreciate it until I found myself in the $100 million company, and there was very little of that available, and there is none of that available in startup land. It is all on-the-job training. Just a very different approach to coming at it, and I'm not suggesting that first-time entrepreneurs that are early in their career should spend a stint in a larger company. I'm just saying that is one of the benefits. The benefit of starting in a startup is you get to see it all. When you're in a big company, you see your function mostly, right? And your role is very narrow. You only wear one hat, even part of a hat. Whereas in a startup, you get to wear 3 to 5 to 10 hats just out of necessity. But if you've never seen what it's like before, you're kind of making it up as you go. So again, those are some trade-offs.
And with those hats, there's many things: marketing, the product, sales. Is there any one of those hats or skills that can be developed that you think maybe is weighted heavier than the others? Maybe it's sales and marketing, or is it about the product? Is there a bottleneck that most founders run into in terms of their skill in one of those hats?
Probably. I hadn't thought about it exactly that way, and I would say that at the different stages of the company, the relative importance of those hats changes. And so you really have to think about the idea development stage. And in that idea development stage, things like customer acquisition, customer success, and customer experience, even marketing, finance and accounting, or if you have a physical product, supply chain logistics, they're just not important. You haven't even proven that you're solving a problem that needs to be solved. And so in the early days during idea development, the hats that are most important relate to that customer discovery and building out, a basic business plan. Then you get to a point where a hat that becomes really important is that fundraising hat. And that's a difficult one because it requires a variety of skills and personality traits. The fundraising founder, usually the one that carries the CEO title, essentially is turned into a salesperson. You see, she has to go out and convince investors to open their checkbook and write a check to her company. She doesn't have a sales title, but she is selling the company. She's selling the vision. She's selling the opportunity. Most founders don't have that experience. They've never been trained to do sales. We have a saying in sales that effective sales requires a transfer of enthusiasm from salesperson to customer.
Yeah.
Fundraising, I say, is the same thing. It requires a transfer of enthusiasm from fundraising founder to investor. If the investor gets as enthusiastic about the opportunity as the founder, you have an opportunity for investment. Most fundraising founders have never done that. So that becomes a very important hat to wear and get good at. If successful, you move on to the next one, and now all of a sudden customer acquisition, which means marketing and sales, becomes super, super important. So do you see how the hats that become important, the relative importance of those hats changes over time? This is why advisors, a good board of directors can be really, really helpful. They might actually partially wear that hat. One of the reasons a startup might bring me onto their board of directors is because of the hat that I can help wear, not on a full-time basis, but at very important points in time.
Right. So it's when you need those skills that matters, to be good at those, or to find somebody else who has those strengths.
Exactly.
I'm curious to know, is there a difference, do you think, in, you mentioned personality, in temperament between the kinds of people who are attracted to and run startups and the temperament of people who are more than happy working within the systems of a big company?
Yeah.
Have you noticed different personality types, or is it a bit of everything?
Well, there are some common traits. An article I wrote that I published on my Shockwave Innovation site is titled "The 8 Personas of Successful Entrepreneurs." The purpose of that article was actually to convey the fact that multiple personas can lead to successful entrepreneurship. We always hear about the hacker-hustler duo, that you either need to be a hacker or a hustler. Okay, good. Those are fine personas to talk about, but I also describe how conservatives and visionaries and explorers and others, I defined 8 of them. It took me about 1.5 years to write that article, not to actually write it down, but to do the thinking and decide on my own, what did I think? What have I observed as the 8 successful personas? And the desperate need to mix those together. If a startup is built of all of the same persona type, it's going to crash and burn. If the first 8 companies, founders and employees into a startup are all hackers or all explorers, it's going to crash and burn. You need that diversity of persona to be successful. But I can say there is a risk tolerance that all of them must have. This is why I celebrate entrepreneurship pursuits during university days while going to college, giving it a try, because an important part of life is figuring out the intersection of things that we like to do and things that we're good at. Mm-hmm. Doing that in a safe setting while you're going to getting your college degree, and you're financially supported by others, either your parents or maybe a side hustle job or a loan or whatever. You have some freedom to experiment and see, are you good at it? And do you like to do it? And it's the like to do it that I find that some founders, as they explored that, they realized that they are not that risk tolerant. The stress that just came from the risk involved, the risk of failure, the risk of crash and burn, just really didn't suit them. That's valuable to learn because they probably should go a different direction. Now maybe later in their life they might develop that risk tolerance, and it might even come from having a couple $100,000 of savings in their bank account, and now they're willing to take a risk. Other founders absolutely loved that risk profile. So I would say whether you're an explorer, a visionary, or some of these other personas that I define that could be successful entrepreneurs, you do have to have a level of risk tolerance, fire in your belly, and some things like that.
Yeah, it seems like there is a big transition that companies have to go through when they get big, of going from that takeoff phase to the cruising altitude.
Yes.
And on your website, Shockwave Innovations, one of the great articles that I found was when corporate execs advise startups.
Yes.
And you mentioned that a little bit earlier, of just the difference in culture, the ways of doing things between the two. How have you seen that transition go from startups? What makes that work in order to have that company go from takeoff to cruising altitude, and then when or what causes that not to work so well?
Yeah, it is a gradual transformation. There's not a light switch that gets flipped on or off, but it does happen. And in the early days, of course, a superpower of a successful startup has to do with experimentation, flexibility, recognizing that something is not working and pivoting as soon as possible. So there needs to be this adaptation and flexibility until a flywheel gets going, and then you want to coalesce around that and get it going more efficient, more productive, and things like that. As the team grows and as the company is down a successful path, it would be reckless to have the same level of experimentation and flexibility and turn left and turn right. It would whipsawing a company of 100 employees or 1,000 employees becomes reckless and has a lot of negative attributes to it. So then, eventually you find yourself maybe as a $100 million company or a $1 billion company, and it's just dramatically different. Probably you're a public company, you have lots of regulations and compliance requirements and things like that, and you're just not afforded the same level of freedom and flexibility as you do in the early days. And you just think, you hear the analogies of turning an aircraft carrier or something like that. It's a very, the captain of that aircraft carrier doesn't just suddenly just announce, hey, everybody, take a hard left. It's a planned activity that probably an hour or two in advance, they know the course is going to change and they're getting ready for that. So the level of planning and strategy that takes place in large organizations to make sure that the 1,000 or thousands of employees all at the same time are on the right path is a very difficult challenge that we don't have to worry about in the early days.
Yeah, that's a lot. I'm curious to know, how many founders do you think you've spoken with in this whole process?
I don't know, thousands.
Thousands.
I've had more than 4,000 graduates of my Founders Academy boot camp. That doesn't mean that I've spoken to all of them. We've brought more than 700 or 800 startups into the Capital Factory portfolio, and I have worked with a large majority of them, meaning sleeves rolled up, discussions, helping through issues and opportunities. So it's, when you say spoken to, is it a hello, shake your hand, I'm Gordon, what's your name? Versus like something like this where I'm in a conference room, but it's a lot.
It's up there.
It's a lot.
So you've obviously been exposed to all different personalities under the sun. Are there any common points of failure or common elements and traits where you think, oh, that person has that thing?
Yeah.
What, in terms of the personality of the founders, has it been correlated with their success at all? Of, oh, this person, the ego gets in the way too much, or this person is driven by so-and-so. What's the common point of failure in the startups you've seen?
On the failure side, there's a million things that can kill a startup, and many of them cannot be seen in the early days, and there is an element of luck and timing and things like that. I can say, though, that two things that I've seen take down startups unnecessarily, in my opinion. One would be founders that are cocky rather than just confident. I talk about the continuum of kind of personality, if you will, and if on one end if you have shy and on the other end you have toxic, well, neither of those are likely suited to be a good startup founder. A shy founder is unlikely to be successful. A toxic founder is going to scorch the earth, all around them. But in the middle, you have on the left side, on the side of shy, is confident. On the right side, trending towards toxic, would be cocky. Now, confidence and cockiness are almost cousins of each other. They're very closely. I talk about the fine line between confidence and cockiness. A cocky founder, to my definition, already has all the answers. So when someone like me with gray hair, battle scars, and stories from a 28-year career speak to them, they don't really listen. And listen is an important word, because I actually don't care if a founder takes my advice, because my advice is just advice. I don't have 100% of the context of what's going on the issue or opportunity. So I'm imparting some advice. I'm actually just trying to help them think through the issue on their own, right?
Yeah.
But a cocky founder doesn't even really listen to what I have to say, because they already have the answer. That causes crash and burn quite often. The second biggest challenge or problem would be co-founders that actually can't figure out how to work well together. So this is a relationship skill. It's not about cockiness, it's about working well together. Founders will find that there are lots of important decisions that need to be made that are very controversial. You want to go left, I want to go right. You have your reasons for left, I have my reasons for right. Can you and I figure out how to come to an agreement? And actually, once we've come to agreement, can we both go down the chosen path with aggression? right? It's easy to say, hard to do, much like a relationship. My wife and I have been married 29 years. That doesn't mean we don't have arguments. That doesn't mean we don't argue, go left, go right kinds of things. It does mean that she and I have figured out how to have arguments in ways that don't destroy our marriage. Founders have to figure that out. Many times founders have not had a relationship for a while, so they come together and it's all lovey-dovey, and then they start facing these issues. And I call it co-founder funk if they can't figure out how to work through that, and the startup crashes and burns.
That's interesting. I forgot who said it, but one way of that being said to me that I found interesting was disagreeing and committing to whatever that person says. So first of all, I think one thing that stuck with me that Elon Musk says is take the default position you're wrong, and your job is to be less wrong, rather than have that cockiness to it where it's self-destructive.
Yeah.
So that ability to say, we disagree, but I'm going to go with what you said for whatever reason, whether you're closer to the problem, and make that happen rather than going nowhere at all.
Yeah.
I think is huge.
Yeah, and we have to set egos aside too, and it's much, much, much harder than most founders think, this issue that I'm describing here, but it is fundamental and critical to success.
Out of you and your career, from the companies you've worked in, founded, advised, what motivates you? Is it curiosity? For some people it's competition, and others it's maybe even fear. Have you found it to be one trait or the other, or is it just overall excitement?
It's pretty easy. The number one thing that drives me is learning. If you're familiar with the book StrengthsFinder 2.0, there was a predecessor to that book that had a different name but by the same author, and as you go through the online exercise and through the book, you discover what your top strengths are, top 5 strengths. A strength is not a skill. A skill can be developed. A strength is more inherent. A strength is more like a personality trait. You can try and fake a different personality, but actually over time you can't really change your personality very much. That's what a strength is. My number one strength was learner, and that's what drove me, and that's what actually the zig and zag that I talked about was very rewarding for me, because I would find myself in a function like sales. I got good at it. I learned a lot about it. I was a very high-performing sales rep for IBM for 6 years or 8 years. But I learned as much as I kind of wanted to about sales, and so then I moved into finance, believe it or not, from sales to finance. I didn't know anything about finance. So the fact that I was learning about finance was very invigorating for me. From there, I went to marketing, believe it or not, and I didn't really know anything about marketing. So that learner in me is what drives me, and it's what drives me today. A lot of founders think that the enjoyment that I get by being an active startup mentor, advisor, investor, board director is giving back, like giving my knowledge to them. And that does drive me a lot. I really do enjoy that. But actually above that, it's the learning that I get. Your next startup, whatever that's going to be, is probably going to be in an area that I am not an expert in. It's in an industry that I am not an expert in, or it's in a technology area like Web3 that Web3 didn't exist when I had my career. So, see, I get to continuously learn through the founders that I help. Yeah. And that will continue to drive me until I'm so old that founders look at me as just this old, decrepit guy and they don't want to listen to me anymore.
Yeah, I love that too, the never stop learning, the curiosity that motivates people. And I can see that just with, especially people in their old age, they tend to become, maybe this is true, closer to who they really are as they let their filters down, as they do more of what they really want to do. Yeah. And I've noticed, speaking with older folks, maybe elderly, is the people who are very curious. They don't want to stop. Yeah. They're obsessed with it. And then, sadly, you can kind of see the people who have checked out, they're just filling their day.
Yeah.
So were you always like that as a kid, that curiosity, was it there from a young age? Were you reading anything? I know a lot of people will read sci-fi books and that paints the picture.
It's a good question. I must have been, as I think about your question, I hadn't actually thought about that. I was a tinkerer. I was kind of an explorer. I liked to build things and make things. I actually enjoyed education. I was one of those, like, school was fun to me, and I wasn't a total nerd, but yes, I did like school. I love science. I loved math, and so there must have been something about that education and the learning part of that that drove me in those earlier days too. Yeah.
So what are you curious about today as you look at the landscape? You mentioned Web3. There's lots of phenomenal projects and visions that people are creating. Mm-hmm. What sticks out to you? What are you excited about in the future?
I would say AI in general is a big one that intrigues me. I have a belief that AI will change the world at the same magnitude or maybe more than the internet did. And I'm old enough to have lived through that. I was helping run companies at the time that the internet became a thing, and we had to figure out what are we going to do with it and all of that. And we messed it all up in the early days and then kind of figured it out. So I see AI being similarly transformative, and that excites me, including sub-disciplines within AI, like robotics. I'm on the board of directors of Apptronic, probably the best robotics startup in the country, and they're one of the few companies that have a walking humanoid robot. And we have labor shortages, and we will need supplemental work to be done because we don't have enough people to do the labor that's needed to fulfill the needs of an aging population. So that's just, to me, a given. So I'm super excited about the prospect of AI and humanoid robots over the next decades becoming an important part of our lives. Web3 is interesting to me. Just really anything that the blockchain can enable is interesting. I do also believe that it's transformative at a level that the internet was. We're so early now that we're very clunky, and it's going to be just like the 1998 to 2001 period of the internet where we don't really know what this is all about, but we're building this capability, and we're going to wake up 3 years or 5 years or 10 years from now and go, that's why the blockchain really is such an important enabler. Those are two, and probably after that, I'm excited about it. I don't see myself getting terribly deeply involved in it, but would be life science and biotech and the pace of innovation that's happening there, and therapeutics and other treatments and things that will allow us to live to 120 or 150 years old and have a very healthy life. That's going to happen, in my lifetime. Yeah.
It's interesting to look at, say, a frontier of any kind. You look at the blockchain, Web3, whatever your phrase of the day is.
Yeah.
For me personally, there's so much financial capital, intellectual capital going into this that I thought I can't not afford to look into this.
Yes.
And to me, the power is there. It's obvious. It's a conservation law applied to the digital world.
Yeah.
And then the question that I ask myself and am trying to ask others is, so what are the use cases? What can you do with that?
Exactly.
Cryptocurrency is one that's extremely interesting to me that I changed my perspective on, but I'm always searching for what those next applications are for, whether it's NFTs or smart contracts. I don't want to say that there are no use cases because that will age terribly.
Sure.
I read an article that was written in 1995 by, I think it was a mathematician, and the title was "The Internet is a Fad." It's like there's no way we're going to order things to our homes and all of these.
Yeah.
Are there any, and maybe this is getting specific, but have you heard of any intriguing use cases for Web3 that are interesting to you?
Not as much yet. Decentralized finance and some of those things I think have a huge potential. They're pointed down a path that there is going to be some regulation, and we need to work its way through a couple of evolutions to really see what that's gonna be. I don't personally get excited at the moment about how NFTs are being used, but I do think that concept of fractional ownership or immutable ownership of things it could be a big deal. So yeah, I'm in the ignorant and naive phase, like many others either are or just won't admit that they are. I respect a lot the really smart people that are deep into this, that are building the current infrastructure. So, I'm an investor in Multicoin Capital. It's one of the largest hedge funds in this particular arena, and I think they are just super smart people, and they're putting their money into companies that are going to build out the infrastructure. So I do like that we're kind of on a simultaneous path where there's experimentation for things that turn out to be silly, and some turn out to be okay but not technically practical or not scalable or whatever. So that experimentation is happening. That helps us figure out what should we really be doing with this. At the same time, there's investment in that infrastructure. So as we figure it out, the infrastructure in platforms like Solana and others to build all this on top of, hopefully all that comes together. But I'm an observer. I'm not deep into it. I'm an experimenter myself. I'm not very active in cryptocurrency, so I've dabbled and done a little of this and a little of that to try and educate myself. I educated myself quite a bit on the underlying technology of the blockchain. I've got an affinity to math and cryptography and things like that, so it intrigued me in that way. The learner in me couldn't help but spend 20 or 30 hours educating myself, but that's about where I am on all that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm still waiting for that big use case, but there are lots of extremely smart people working on this.
It'll happen. That's the thing I can guarantee. I can't say it'll be 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, but I believe in a 5-year horizon it will be more crystal clear, some of the killer use cases, and others will then follow after that.
That'll be interesting to see. I want to talk a bit about your book, Startup Success, Funding the Early Stages of Your Venture. So I listened to the audiobook version of this, and it was probably the most comprehensive guide on raising capital, and I've caught a few other people reading it as well who absolutely love it. To those who are just looking at this, maybe they're a founder, maybe they just want to know what that process is like, what can they learn from reading this book?
Like a lot of things, we need to learn it first. Education is different than advice and whatnot. So building a foundation of education in a particular topic, of learning the vocabulary, learning how things tend to work and don't work, and how to think about this, how to think about that, is an important foundation for then putting it into practice. As you put it into practice, here's what I found with my book. Founders will read it. They'll gain a lot of insights and education into the vocabulary and the process and the do's and the don'ts and the issues that they might encounter and how to overcome them. But then they get out on the fundraising trail and real things start happening. They're really meeting with investors, and investors are asking difficult questions, and they're pushing back on valuation. I find that what the founders then do is, they go right back to my book, go straight back to that chapter. And I've seen a lot of founders that will show me their copy of my book with lots of dog-eared pages and highlighted sections. Then they'll even tell me, I had 18 pages dog-eared and 14 highlighted sections before I got on the fundraising trail, and halfway into the fundraising trail, look at my book now. I have 48 pages dog-eared and whatever. And I really take pride in that the book serves as an educational tool as well as something to reference back to as you're actually fundraising. And I specifically wrote it in such a way that it should be helpful for a pre-seed round of funding, maybe from friends and family, a seed round of funding from maybe institutional investors even, and even a Series A round of funding, which the startup needs to be at a different place. So, because I wanted the book to survive through those three kind of significant stages of funding. I possibly will do a second edition of the book one of these days. I've already got something like 35 or 45 notes to myself of things I would add if I ever decide to crack that open again. So that's been fun.
Yeah. Well, when some people write books, you can get all the content on 10 pages, and then their editor, their publisher is like, oh, you have to make this 200 pages.
Yeah.
Not this. Okay, there is bomb after bomb of just gems of info, and it's totally one of those field manuals for raising money.
Thank you.
I'm curious, what inspired you to write this? Was there a moment, or it just grew on you of, I really just need to formalize all this knowledge?
Well, I guess it started with me writing things down going back to about 2000, so let's say 22 years ago. If I got asked for a piece of advice more than once, the same topic, more than once in a 6-month period of time, the second time I got asked the question, I would just write it down and I would send it to the person and say, hey, read this and then let's chat, right? I called them advice documents. I amassed a collection of them, a dozen or something like that. And then, in 2005, I put it on a website. Before WordPress, I just put it up on a website. And I just, as topics would then occur to me, I would just keep adding to them. We didn't use the word blog back then, but that's effectively what I was doing. I found myself 3 years ago or so with about 120 articles published, maybe 130, with fundraising being the most popular, topic of those articles that I wrote. And what happened was I would have founders during my office hours tell me how they consumed, a lot of my articles, let's say on fundraising specifically, and they would ask, Gordon, is there an order I should have read those articles? Because I didn't write the articles in a particular order. I wrote them as the topics occurred to me. So if you read my fundraising articles in chronological order of publishing, it actually wouldn't be the right order. And so I found myself saying, well, actually, you should read these 3 first, and then this, and then somebody said, "Guy, have you thought about just writing a book?" And I realized that would be interesting. Like, could I take this content that I've written, and how much of a book would that make if I put it in the right order, and what would be missing? So about half of the book kind of came from articles I had written. You can't just glob together a bunch of articles and call it a book, right? There was a lot of work to stitch that together and have it flow. But then the other half of the book had to be written kind of natively throughout the manuscript development process with my editor. So, but that's how it started. A founder said, "Man, you got a lot of good stuff on your blog. Is there an order that I should read that for fundraising? Have you ever thought about writing a book?" So
that's how it came to be.
Yeah.
When people are considering raising money, how does funding change a picture of a company? Are there any new expectations to grow, let's say, or anything that they should know before they just kind of, like, a lot of people will think, oh, to start a company, I have to raise money, which isn't always true. But of course, if you want to grow fast, that is something that's the quickest path to get there. Would you say there's anything that changes significantly that founders ought to be aware of?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is the fork in the road that you hinted at, which is tech founders mostly. So when I say founders and I say startups, in my world it's tech startups. There are other founders that start other types of businesses that are not tech. So when I say founders and startups, I'm thinking tech. The founder or founding team should really decide for themselves, what is success? A lot of founders come into it, and because of the influence we have with everything that's around us, we kind of default, just assume that means raise multiple rounds of funding, grow into a unicorn, celebrate, make $1 billion, be the next Elon Musk or whoever, right? But that's not necessarily the case. A lot of founders find themselves having built a company that is consistently generating $1 million or $2 million or maybe $10 million a year in revenue. They've got 10 or 20 or 50 happy, employees, and tens or hundreds or thousands of happy customers or users, and they just don't have the ability to scale beyond that. But that could be great success. That could be really rewarding. That could be a great company. So not every company needs necessarily or should go down the venture funding path. When you go down that fork of the road, important implications come with it. When you borrow money from a bank or you take out a mortgage for a home, you probably know the bank or the mortgage company expects their money back with interest. When you go down the venture funding path, the venture style investors, they don't just want their money back, they want 10 times their money back. And that's because so many of the other investments crash and burn that they need outliers that really give them a huge return. So I talk about fundraising. Each time you raise a round of venture style funding, angel investors, VCs, whatever, each time you raise that round of funding, you are signing up for a new tour of duty until you have delivered a significant return on investment to that stage of investor. It's a really important decision. And going into each one, okay, you're about to raise a Series A. Are you and the team prepared to row on the oars as hard as possible until you've given those Series A investors a 10x return on their investment? Yes? Okay, awesome. Let's go. Series B. Hey team, are we ready to sign up for the next tour of duty so we can give the Series B investors a significant return on their investment? It's lost on a lot of founders that with each of those, you are signing up for an important tour of duty. So that would be a significant implication that needs to be understood.
Absolutely. And who shouldn't raise money?
Well, there's two reasons to raise money. You either want the money or you need the money. And most fundraising founders raise money because they need it, meaning if they don't raise money, they otherwise are going to have a bank account that ends up with a dollar sign followed by a zero, and they have to pack up their toys and go home. This is because their revenues are not exceeding their expenses, or their gross profits not exceeding their expenses, and they don't have a viable business. So, okay, we have to, if you want to keep going, then, you have to raise money or dial back and reset your expectations. Want is different. There are some founders that are raising money because they want it. They don't have to have it. Their bank account's not going to go to zero, but they aspire to accomplish more faster. They want to shift 2 gears as opposed to just gradually moving a little bit faster, right? They want to take this and they want it to go like that. Startups that raise money out of want have a lot of options. If they don't like the valuation, they don't have to raise. If they want to raise $5 million, but there's not $5 million of interest, there's only $3 million of interest, they could choose to take a lower amount of money. They could choose to wait and grow into their shoes, grow into the valuation. So there are times not to raise money. That could be the founders that are raising out of want and the conditions just aren't there. Well, then don't raise money, wait. It's a personal decision. That's the other thing. Again, you might choose to not raise money because you and the founding team are not ready to sign up for that tour of duty. You've been working on this for 8 or 10 years and you're getting tired and you want to ring the cash register and move on to the next thing, things like that.
Well, throughout your whole career and what you've done, anything great comes with, I believe, growth and the growing pains that come with that. What's been one of the biggest challenges or moments of adversity that you've faced, and how did you overcome that, and what was your mindset during that?
I'm sure there's been a million, and my brain probably tries to tuck them away in closets and close it and lock the door. But yeah, the gray in my hair and the battle scars that I have, many of those are from difficult times, stress, 80-hour weeks, for years on end, that kind of stuff. I'd say maybe one of the first ones was 6-year stint working for an Israeli tech company. I was president for 4 of those years, and I hadn't learned well how to delegate. I carried the whole company on my shoulders. I was operating as president and middle manager and individual contributor all at one. I was writing white papers. I mean, we were a 150 employee company at some point along that journey. We even grew more than that. Yeah, and I just hadn't learned to delegate and kind of balance. I wasn't a leader. I was a good manager. I was smart. I was a good strategist. I was a good individual contributor. And after that gig, we took that company public and then sold it to a larger conglomerate in Israel. And I took time off after that. And I was going to take up to a year off or until I got itchy to go back in. I made it 5 months or so before I was ready to jump back in. I realized after that time off that I was way out of balance in a bad way. I hadn't figured out how to delegate. So that was a real diverse moment. There was a learning experience, followed by jumping into a turnaround opportunity. I felt kind of bulletproof. I felt like that gig had a good success, and there was a struggling company that had raised a ton of money. The investors were not happy. The investors decided to give some more money. They ejected the CEO and half of the executive team, brought in a new executive team, me included. 0 revenue after 4 years. It was a semiconductor company. That was painful, very painful. It was dysfunctional. The team was extremely dysfunctional. The investors were not forgiving, even though they had a whole new team. They just didn't give us any honeymoon period to get anything going. I lasted about 18 months. The company, we sold the company for pennies on the dollar to the investors, and I got out of there, and that was a big learning experience for me as well.
So learning to delegate was a big part.
That was a big one, yeah, for sure.
Is there any, I don't like the word hacks, but strategies of learning to delegate? Was it just trusting another person, or is it, like for me, a big part as I continue to grow is I don't need to know all the details. That's what I'm going to hire the expert for.
Yeah.
How did you make that process or that transition of going from trying to do many things at once to delegating much more than normal?
Mm-hmm. In my case, when I first had my revelation, I was promoted to a manager, so my first time of managing a small team, and I had to give performance reviews for my team members. And I gave one of my team members not the highest rating, but the whatever was right below that, right? And he wasn't happy about it. We debated it kind of during the performance review, and afterwards he escalated it to my boss. My boss and I talked, and what I discovered, I'll skip through kind of the process. I discovered that the reason I gave this guy a not perfect rating but one below is because he didn't do his tasks the way I would have done them. He accomplished the result that we needed, but he didn't do it the way I would have. This was very enlightening to me. The fact that, and because I was a pseudo-perfectionist at the time, maybe less so now, I think, and I thought my way, because I had had success. Now, I was an expert in the function that I managed. I was an expert and I'd had success. I learned that there are different paths to a desirable outcome. In fact, a different path than I would take might lead to a better outcome. Then the game changed for me. Observing an employee taking a different path, not knowing how it's going to work out because I never did it that way, and how far down the path might I let it go? And do I see they're about to fall off a cliff? And so this became kind of a personal game with me, allowing those to play out, even into uncomfortable moments for me, just to see, is there a revelation that there is a different way to do this? That was my learning experience for figuring out how to delegate.
That's extremely useful, because I know a lot of people, and myself included, I did this all the time with just programming. I would have a way that I thought it would be done.
Yes.
And then there's that tendency to want to look over the shoulder and see if it matches your path. But a lot of the times, especially if you hire somebody smarter than you, they'll get there a different way.
Oh my goodness. So I have a computer science degree, but coding is a great example of that, because I remember one time on an assignment, it happened to be just right in my sweet spot, and I spent time thinking about it first. My buddy just dove straight in and started writing code. And when we finished, he had 1,500 lines of code. I had 365 or something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was kind of that ratio.
Yeah.
And as we both finished, he asked me a question like, hey, how many lines was yours? I was 365. He's like, what? I'm like 1,500. How did you do that?
Yeah.
And those of you that are listening to this that are coders, you will understand and appreciate that. If you've ever been with a master developer and you watch not just how it's not just lines of code, it's just the brilliance in the way that it's done, and you realize, especially in development, there's probably 10 ways to solve any particular problem, right? That's a good example.
Yeah. If you can go back in time and talk to your 18-year-old self, your 20-year-old self, what would you tell him? Maybe a piece of advice, a recommendation, a warning, maybe do something sooner. What would you say?
I would say, when faced with fear, just run through the fire. Your survival strengths will take over. You'll get on the other side of the fire line, and great and wonderful things will happen. I had a fear factor that influenced me for a long time, and I learned to run through the fire. There was a time where I took a big risk. It worked out amazingly well, but man, the fear factor was difficult, and there was something that tipped me over. And in that moment, after that realization, I literally told myself, next time that happens, just freaking run through the fire. You'll get on the other side of the fire, your survival strengths will kick in, and you're going to have a great time. I had to tell myself that 2 or 3 or 5 times after that, and then it just became more part of my psyche. So learning that earlier and telling myself that might have, there possibly were some go left, go right decisions that the fear factor caused me to go one way versus the other. I'd love to go back and take that other branch.
Run through the fire.
Yeah,
I love that.
Just run through the fire.
I'm curious, are there any books that have made an impact on your life? Are you a reader, or is it the trials of being in the trenches, of doing things that have taught you what you know?
I am a reader. I'm not a voracious reader, and there's no single book that really jumps out, I would say. I read to educate myself mostly, but there's not any one book that just, aha. I did enjoy The Hard Thing About Hard Things from Ben Horowitz. It was, that one kind of jumps out. There's possibly a half a dozen others that are kind of like that. It's more kind of a collection of a lot of different books, probably. Yeah.
Well, experience is the best teacher. Would you say you learned mostly via experience, or were there some advisors or mentors that were valuable to you?
I've had some valuable mentors, but I would say 98% for me, just getting out there and doing it and screwing some things up and learning from that, having some successes, working my ass off. That's 98% of it. I did have some good mentors that gave me good advice at particular points in time, but it was more OJT.
Just running through the fire, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think it was a great way to end it. Is there anything that you'd like to part with the audience? Any advice, any words of potential wisdom?
I think just that main thing is maybe something we talked about earlier on. For those that haven't found that combination of things they really like to do and things that they're honestly good at, keep pursuing that. If you're still young in your career, experiment, try this, try that, to find the things that you really, really are good at and really, really like. If you can find that intersection, that will be the foundation for a really long career. Maybe ending up at a place like I am right now, where I work a lot, but I don't stress a lot, and it's just I work because I want to, not because I have to, and it's a great place to be.
Well, Gordon, this was fantastic. Where can people find you if they want to hear more?
Yeah, most of my insights, most of my knowledge is on that Shockwave Innovations website. That's where all my articles are. I've got a page on my book. I've got an online curriculum called Founders Academy. It's free and self-paced. So most of my best insights, advice, and pieces of my brain and thoughts are on that Shockwave Innovations website.
Excellent. Well, it was wonderful having you, and I know a lot of people are going to get just a tremendous amount of value from this. So
thank you.
Thanks again, and that's the end of the episode.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.